do like working with students. I love talking about research. So what they asked me to do was pick a topic that I'm thinking about and think is interesting and talk about it. So I'm going to do that. But I was also asked to talk a little bit about career path. I wasn't quite sure. In my case, that was it's kind of all over the place. But I thought I would spend a little bit of time right at the beginning talking about sort of why I'm interested in the things I'm interested in and what research questions have held my attention for a long time, and sort of point in some directions where work is ongoing, and would really be interested in hearing from any of you. Any of these areas are of interest to you. But I want to go way back. So Dave and I, we share many things. We share research interests. We also share our Canadian citizenship and our pride of being Canadian. On the first slide, I'll start with that. So in terms of how I became interested in these topics, and as Dave said, I'm an economist by training, but I wasn't born an economist. I wasn't born, interested in the kinds of things that conventional economists typically study. And so the way I got interested in the research that I'm doing goes back to like when I was a teenager, and I used to spend my summers in Ontario doing canoe trips for like 2 months at a time. And I'm dating myself. This was like early 1990s. And at that time, sort of acid rain was taking hold, and I would go through a forest one summer and it would look fine, and then 3 summers later it would look like this. So for like a hippie Ontario 16-year-old, this was like, what is happening? And it was, everyone understood what was happening. It was acid rain. And there was a lot of sort of public attention and concern about this kind of thing. And so I got really interested in just like basically environmental impacts on forests and lakes in the place I grew up, and went to college at Cornell to be an ecologist, and I was all about like the science. And then sort of slowly realized, number one, a lot of the science was pretty well understood, and even the technological solutions or ways to mitigate the problem were reasonably well understood. And what was really not going well was the economic incentives so that firms and agents would adopt those solutions and start mitigating the problem. And I also learned that I actually really loved economics. So I started taking some environmental economics classes, and I got totally sucked in. So then, I did lots of other things. I did the Canadian equivalent of the Peace Corps and some other wanderings, and then ended up doing a PhD at Berkeley in the ARE department. And that was a completely amazing, this was not planned, but it was one of the most amazing times to be doing a PhD in an environmental economics department at Berkeley. Number one, this was in the, you guys are far too young to remember, but this was in the wake of the electricity crisis. And I was a graduate student sitting at the lunch table with people like Jim Borenstein, or Jim Bushnell, who many of you people know, Severin Borenstein, Catherine Wolfram, and here are a bunch of economists who were like in the thick of the policy debate, sort of unpacking like what had happened, and more importantly, like what could we learn from this train wreck to take to the next step. And so I was sort of listening and really engaged in this restructuring of the California electricity sector. And I think the thing that totally impressed me about it and made me excited to want to become an economist was, at least from my view, these economists were really, number one, trying to understand and elucidate what had happened and what went wrong, and then come up with constructive recommendations as to how to make it better going forward. I remember I was like hippie Canadian environmentalist person, so the market design questions were engaging, but what was also super interesting was during that time, when I was a PhD student at Berkeley, it was the dawn of AB 32, which set in motion, as many of you, or maybe all of you are aware, a number of, at the time, it felt super ambitious, climate policies designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with a lot of emphasis on the electricity sector. So renewable portfolio standards and carbon pricing and all sorts of things. So it was sort of the combination of being at Berkeley and being a graduate student, and then seeing these real world policy developments that made me super interested in not only environmental economics, but also electricity. So I wanted to talk a little bit, I'm going to focus today on renewable energy in California, because I think there's so many interesting economic policy questions tied up in what's unfolding. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other research questions and areas that I find interesting, that I've been working on over the past over 10 years, 15 years, and where I think there's a lot more to be done. One is, and this is sort of getting back to those pictures from the Canadian wilderness, is air pollution and market-based regulation of. So I was, in high school when the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 were passed, and sort of was watching the acid rain program unfold, and continue to be really interested in use of market-based regulation, cap and trade programs, emissions pollution taxes, in terms of not only how they can work. And this picture is just taken from the EPA website, and I'm sorry the text is so small, but what you're looking at is some of the criteria pollutants that we know do great damage to our health, such as sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide. Both are precursors to PM2.5, ozone and acid rain. And the blue is the stationary fuel combustion sources. So those are the ones I've tended to focus on. And a good news story here is we've seen, as maybe you know, a really amazing decline in those emissions. And policy has, it's not fully responsible, but has played a pretty important role, especially in SO2 and NOx. So I have spent a lot of my career, research career, thinking about, so the other thing that's amazing about working in electricity markets, which I should have mentioned, is data. So I can, in my pajamas at home, download hourly emissions, generation, you name it, for every power plant in the country. And that's pretty amazing. And it means that you can not only ask interesting questions about how firms should be responding to permit market incentives, or how, the kinds of investments you'd expect they could be making. You can bring those to the data and ask like empirical questions about, are firms doing what our economics textbooks tell us they should be doing? And more importantly, when they're not doing that, why? What is happening? So a number of my research papers ask those kinds of questions, right? So what is actually happening in these markets? Are they working as well as we think they can work? And in the cases where they're not, what might we be able to do next time to get closer to our sort of objectives and goals? This second question is a really important one, and I think it's getting more and more attention, as it should. Economists are often focused on efficiency. Let's get that find the way to reduce the cost of meeting an emissions target. But of course, with every environmental policy, there'll be winners and losers, and there are potentially trade-offs between efficiency and distribution. So some of my work, including a paper a while back now, looking at a little cap and trade program in California, asked questions about which neighborhoods, which communities are gaining from the emissions reductions and which ones not so much. And I think this line of inquiry, California is really pushing the envelope as I see it, and trying to engage with local communities and make sure that the emissions reductions that we're working towards benefit everyone, and maybe even disproportionately benefit those communities that have traditionally suffered disproportionately from environmental exposure. So I think there's a rich line of more research to be done there, and more thinking. You're starting to see it in California. When your policy does not deliver a solution that you think is as equitable as you would like it, you can either change the policy, or you can think about redistribution or transfer payments and things of that nature. And you're starting to see some really hard thinking about how that might work in practice as well. So that's exciting and important. And finally, have done some work, and this work will continue. When I draw these policies on the board for my undergraduates, carbon tax or a cap and trade program, I usually draw lines for marginal abatement costs and marginal. They're lines with big confidence intervals around them. Sometimes we don't even know how to put confidence intervals around them. And so that creates all sorts of real world challenges when a policymaker is trying to sort of follow an economist's prescription, but she finds sort of dizzying amounts of uncertainty. And so thinking a little bit more about the practical implications of that uncertainty, I think is interesting. There's economic substance there, but there's also practical. So I'm still interested in air pollution. And one of the things that I'm sure many in this room are thinking about is I've seen in my career a revolution in the data we have to describe exposure to air pollution. So what I'm showing you here, taken from a little short paper that we published recently, just contrasting the data that I, in graduate school, was working with, which is a sparse grid of pollution monitors, 2,000 for the whole country. So it used to be that your best read of your air quality was some monitor located possibly in the next county, depending on where you live. Now you get cool pictures like this, and this is just, I should have put scales on here, but the yellow areas are bad, meaning higher levels of PM2.5 concentration. Now using combinations of remote sensing and satellite data and lots of fancy science to map the satellite measures of aerosol optical depth to PM2.5 concentrations, we get estimates, spatially continuous, like high spatial resolution estimates of pollution exposure, and that's super exciting, but they are estimates. So I think we've got a little bit more distance to travel so that researchers like us can use these estimates to ask causal questions about the implications of changing exposure on outcomes we care about, like health, because we've done a little bit of work to document how these estimates are still really noisy and sometimes biased. But the point is we're getting a much better read. I have a purple air sensor in my house, and I think like we run experiments all the time, and I think there's just more and more and more that's becoming possible as sensor costs come down. And remote sensing, access to remote sensing data expands. One thing that I think is pretty interesting, and maybe I'm not giving the situation enough credit, but if you think about how this big data, remote sensing, sensor revolution, how it's transformed things like our understanding of deforestation, or maybe just like the forest fires, and contrast that with what we've been able to do with local air pollution regulation, there's a big difference, and that's because it's not enough to just characterize where the problem is. We got to figure out where the problem's coming from, right? It's hard to use this data and turn it into better regulation of local air pollution when there's a lot of source attribution that still needs to happen. So I'm working a little bit with some atmospheric scientists kind of push in that direction. What has to happen before we can use really amazing data on characterizing exposure and use it to improve significantly our local air pollution regulations? You guys are all really quiet. I teach at Berkeley. Make me feel at home. You should like feel free to put your hand up if you disagree or you're disgruntled or okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. What do you feel about the sort of new generation of like air quality modeling that takes stuff from chemical transport models and more regression-based type things? I know you work with work, so AP2. Easier, I don't know if you've heard of that one.
Yeah, so we're doing a little bit of, we're trying to do some ground truth. So I've got, we were just talking about this. So we're doing we have a research project going on that's trying to do a little bit of ground truthing of those models.
Yeah.
Because they're super powerful, but there could be things on the ground happening that those models aren't accounting for. So for example, we've become very interested in, kind of off topic, but I'd be curious of what, because it's like on my hard drive and hasn't seen the light of day yet. We're really interested in when we model the impacts of a regulation, say the Mercury rule or the Clean Power Plan. We say, okay, this coal plant's going to shut down, and then all the pollution that would have traveled across states, won't happen, and so you're going to be better off. Your exposure will reduce by 3 micrograms per cubic meter. But what happens if you're living in a non-attainment county? And so that improvement in air quality, your local regulator permits other sources right back up to the constraint. There'll be a regulatory takeback that gets us something in terms of economic activity, but gives up something in health. So we're sort of interested in understanding, now that we have better ability to measure what's happening on the ground, when do those models do a really good job of predicting exposure changes, and when they're not doing such a good job, and why. So I think that there's exciting work to be done in terms of ground truthing the models we've relied on perhaps too heavily in the past, with the better data we have access to. Okay. Other sort of line of inquiry that I continue to work in because I think it's really important and exciting and fun. So now we're moving to the demand side of energy markets, and we're thinking about things like energy efficiency and demand response. There's lots of people at Davis working on these topics. And so I think there's this broad-based excitement about the potential to advance energy efficiency and leverage demand response more rigorously. But this does lead to questions about, okay, but which energy efficiency investments and what type of demand response programs? Which ones work and which ones don't? The jumping off point for this research agenda, it's sort of like the grumpy one that we were just talking about. Sometimes those engineering for those projections don't quite match what we see on the ground, and that's important to know if you're trying to move finite resources to support the most promising investments. And so I've done a bunch of work and continue to do some that really tries, and sometimes these are like really Debbie Downer papers, to look what's happening and say, okay, let's use the best causal inference techniques we have. Let's take a clear-eyed view of the results we're seeing on the ground and ask, are these investments delivering what we thought they would? To keep things balanced, I have one paper that was like super depressing to write. It was a big field experiment in Michigan. We looked at the efficiency investments that we thought were like really paid for themselves in months. This is weatherization, go and seal up a building and put more energy efficient windows. We ran a randomized experiment because the concern with comparing these investments, the people who installed the efficient windows, and the people who didn't, those people are different, and you worry that the differences in energy consumption are driven by differences in the people versus differences in the things that the investments they chose to make. So I'm happy to talk after about the details, but we basically ran an experiment that generated random variation in the adoption of these weatherization investments. We found economically significant efficiency or energy savings at 20%, but these were less than a third of what the engineering projections anticipated. And so that meant we really weren't getting what we expected. And we were able, I think, not definitively, but we ruled out rebound, and really what was happening, and this is when we went back up the hill to talk to the engineers to say, what do you think? And so folks at LBL said, well, we're not that surprised when you think about if you seal up a house in Michigan and your engineering model thinks you did a perfect job, but actually you left like a hole in the corner and all that heat is escaping into the Michigan winter, it seems plausible that those realization rates are going to be low. That was kind of that's not to say all energy efficiency will not realize its projections. It is to say that a pretty important type of energy efficiency, if not installed correctly, will not deliver the benefits that you might expect. Yeah.
When we're evaluating sort of these questions around the energy efficiency gap, I see like the cost of carbon come up a lot. But like, I mean, you mentioned before, like there's so much uncertainty about the cost of carbon.
Yep.
So how can you say, is it hard to say anything conclusive about things like this?
So we back into the number. In our paper, we back into the number. So we say, okay, we thought that these were going to be, forget social cost of carbon. We thought these were going to be privately cost effective. We thought that our energy savings would rationalize the investment we made. And that didn't turn out to be the case. What would the social cost of carbon have to be to make this a cost-effective investment? And we found a social cost of carbon on the range of $200. Now, we may think that that is what the social cost of carbon should be, but I think we could probably find other investments that make more sense if, at lower social cost of carbon. So I agree with you, and the way we sort of hunt on that is to say, okay, well, we don't know what the social cost of carbon is, but what would it have to be to make this investment make sense? So that was a depressing story, so let me tell you really quick. We also, this is hopefully forthcoming very soon, it's been around for a while. We ran a field experiment with SMUD. And here the idea was we've been investing a lot in smart meters. We're all really excited about smart meters. Imagine what smart meters could do. But when utilities send you a shiny pamphlet saying join our real-time pricing program because you can, you send it to the recycling bin if you're a typical electricity customer. And that means that investment, we're not taking full advantage of it. So what we work with SMUD to do is say, well, economists have documented this default effect. That is, when you default customers into something, they often are inclined to stay there, even if it's a really important decision. So with organ donation, you can take organ donation from 10 to 90%. You default people in. That's about what we found with demand critical peak pricing. We went from about 10% to 90%. But with organ donation, this is pretty crass, but like you just need people to tick the box, so then you're done. Whereas with critical peak pricing or demand response, you need to get them in the program, but you also need them to respond. Otherwise, they're not very useful to you. So the good news is that we found that the people we nudged into the program responded on average. Not as much as like the guy I'm married to who gets so excited about electricity consumption and will re-optimize in a critical day. But enough such that when you look at the average demand response across two groups, the guys who were defaulted in, and the ones who had to opt in, the average effect on the households that were defaulted in was 2.5 times as large. So from a utilities perspective, this is like big deal. Because a simple switch in terms of how they design the program can dramatically increase the impact of those programs. And finally, so I've been working on, oh yes.
Just a question on that. Yeah. Could that be because houses that opt in already like had consumption patterns that didn't have to adjust much, and so they're like, oh, I could save
no,
money.
let me be clear. So the eager opt-iners, they had a much larger demand response.
Nice.
But when you just look at the two, so imagine you've got 200 households and 100 said you got to opt in, and 100 said you're in, you got to opt out. When you compare across this is intent to treat.
The whole
group,
group,
yes,
yeah.
the whole group.
Got it.
So for the carbon efficiency, intent to treat. When you actually look at the eager ones, their response is much larger than the compliers, the ones who were in there because we nudged them. But what the utility cares about more is just like, if I opt in versus I opt out, what do I get? Lots more with that default. Yep.
What do you think about the political feasibility of actually making the default? Because, I mean, most utilities now across, like investor-owned utilities across the country actually have invested in smart meters over the past 10 years.
Yes.
And there's mostly a political
Yes.
infeasibility. The regulator is like, no, I'm appointed by the
Yes.
governor and the legislature. Like, people don't want to be exposed to the risk.
Yes.
And therefore, like, we have the programs available, but we have 0.1% uptake of these programs. What does it take to actually just say, no, this is the efficient solution. It's the fair way to price your power as well. Like, this is what you get.
It's a great question. So the way we're writing the paper now, and it's finally, just hope it finally hits, is we spend a lot of time not just documenting the default effect, but trying to understand what's the mechanism, because that really matters. So the first response we've actually testified in hearings where this exact point comes up. One point to make is like, well, look, you're picking a default one way or the other, right? So people have been stuck on this like status quo rate, and you can sort of demonstrate that like the average customer will do better. So in some sense, it's not clear a priori whether the default, which default is better for the representative customer. But what we also do in the paper is really try and make the case that what's going on here is rational inattention. And I'll send you the paper and see if you're convinced. It's not that we defaulted people in and the switching cost was so high they were trapped in this like hell that they couldn't get out of. It was that it's like $2, $3 a summer. So people were rationally inattentive to this option. Once they were in, they're like, yeah, I'll respond. And from a social perspective, that makes a huge difference. There are power plants we're not building to reduce peak. From any individual consumer's perspective, it's actually rational to not pay attention to this and just like move on with your kids' t-ball game and grocery shopping. So that's the argument we're trying to build, which is what's going on here is a rational inattention that is socially important to overcome with a little nudge. Not a mandatory assignment, but a little nudge that if you really hate it, that's a great question. Yep.
Any socioeconomic differences into the accounting and how those responses cause a difference?
Yeah, so we did look, we're limited. We had whether people were on a low income rate, we know sort of where they are located. So we did look for differences both in the likelihood that they would opt in or out. And then once in or out, like was attrition higher? Once we start cutting the data, the confidence intervals get higher. But if anything, at least low-income customers seem more responsive. So if they were going to gain from the program, they're more likely to actually go into the program. No differences in attrition whatsoever, but not dispositive. More research needed in terms of really plumb the depths of that. Yep.
Does this contradict other research that suggested that customers respond to like the average electricity prices they pay other than the marginal prices they're paying?
Well, I think here it's a salient. So there's been some subsequent research on like what's going on there. In a critical peak pricing program, the salience of the rate at that time, right, is really high. So I think that you're focusing, this is a high rate day, you're focusing your attention. So I'd be careful on comparing this and saying, well, it contradicts that because the setting is just the choice setting is so different. Okay, finally, so I'm interested in climate, I'm interested in environmental issues, I'm interested in energy. Pre-tenure, I just stuck to what I knew, which is the US and Canada. Post-tenure, it's kind of crazy to be worried about climate change and studying Sacramento, California. So have since moved into thinking about emerging economies where we think all the energy growth is going to happen. So we have a field experiment running in India. India is very interesting because it is a context in which there's real concern about sustainable energy choices and environmental impacts, but there's also real concern about economic development and extending energy access to low-income consumers who've had poor access. So we are sort of experimenting with energy efficient fans and storage to see if, the basic idea is as follows. If you're a low income household who doesn't pay much for electricity because it's subsidized, why the heck would you invest in energy efficiency? Because the upfront cost is high and you're not paying the energy price. So originally I thought this was like a losing battle. But then we are several years into an LED program where LEDs cost 100 rupees, conventional bulb costs 9 rupees, but over the 3 years I've been visiting India twice a year, the adoption rate of LEDs has just been like staggering. When you do surveys and say, why are you buying these LEDs? It's because they have better light, they're more durable, they're more resilient, they're a better product. Energy efficiency, if mentioned, is like 4 or 5 cents. So that's really interesting. The energy efficiency adoption has been dramatic at a high upfront cost, but it's not energy efficiency that's really driving these decisions. So that's great, but then the next rung of the energy ladder is fans. And an energy efficient fan, any energy efficient fan I've ever met is not better than its conventional alternative. It runs a little slower, you gotta sit a little closer. So we're thinking, how the heck can we make these energy efficient fans more appealing? And what we're experimenting with is the following. Reliability in the area we're working in is really bad, 7, 8, 9 hours a day. If we can find cheap storage solutions to pair with fans, a conventional fan won't run as long on this battery as a more efficient fan. We're trying to experiment with this idea that one benefit of energy efficiency in a cooling setting could be it's easy to make investments in reliability and get more for your dollar. So we're working with IIT Mumbai to see if that actually plays out, if consumers are actually interested in and value storage, and if they are more inclined to buy a more efficient fan when near the best storage. Okay, third area that I'm interested in, I promise I will talk about renewables, is thinking about incomplete emissions regulation. So this is a map that you can't see for some reason because it's disappeared into my slide, but it is a global map. And what it's showing you, this is a World Bank project. It just keeps track of carbon pricing across the globe and updates it periodically. And what the map is showing you is the 20% full glass is that roughly 20% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide are now subject to a carbon price that's not zero. And that's progress. But of course, the other view is that that's 80% empty, right? A lot of carbon emissions are not subject to any kind of carbon price. And so this creates real challenges if you're a policymaker in California or Canada or Australia or Europe. It's trying to move ahead with a carbon price that's not zero. It's $20. Maybe you're in Switzerland, it's $100. So what's the concern? I'll channel the cement producers here in California, and they say, look, if you put a price on carbon, $20 price on cement production in California, we increase significantly our operating costs. And what could very well happen is we will lose the ability to compete with our international rivals. So congratulations, California, you've reduced emissions associated with cement production in California, but you've increased the emissions associated with cement consumption in California because you're importing cement, you're sticking it on a boat, and you're bringing it from some country where the cement production is even dirtier than it is here. So that's an exaggerated scenario, but you can see how it's a plausible scenario. So leakage is the jargon term. Emissions leakage refers to increases in emissions in outside jurisdictions that's caused by environmental regulations that are incomplete. They apply to only a subset of the sources contributing to the problem. I've worked on leakage now for like 6 or 7 years. I think the upshot is it's super messy, the solution to this problem. So some people have gone on record as saying this problem is untractable. And so we should just wait till the world comes together in that kumbaya moment where we can agree on a single carbon price. And it's going to be too long a wait, if you ask me. So I think it behooves us to work on some of these messy imperfect solutions. So I've done some work thinking about leakage in California's electricity sector, so leaking to other states. We have a paper that looks at leakage rates in the domestic cement sector, and they're economically significant. I mean, leakage will happen, and it's a question of how to mitigate it. And now Marwan and I have this paper that hopefully we're releasing at the end of next month. It's been a long time working on it because it has been hard to make the data cooperate. But just thinking about if you're a policymaker, how might you assess leakage rates in different industries? and think about conferring be it production subsidies or border carbon adjustments, various measures that jurisdictions have been experimenting with to mitigate leakage and strike a balance between creating an incentive to abate within your jurisdiction and mitigating the leakage to other jurisdictions. Okay, so finally, the other research area that I've worked on in the past, and really the remainder of the time I'll spend more just like talking about what's happening in California, where I think research could really advance our understanding, is the rise of non-hydro renewables. So you've probably all seen a picture like this before, and it's just showing you how, over the past 10, 15 years, a lot has been happening in the fuel mix and electricity. You've seen this decline in coal, which has been driven by a number of things, including the shale gas boom and the rise of renewables are some of the factors. And this little green line here, right? So you got slow but steady rise of non-hydro renewables, primarily wind and solar. And so what this is, I think, really interesting to an economist is you've got this, amazing things happening in terms of technological breakthroughs and innovation that's bringing down the cost of these technologies. Part of that policy-driven, but probably not all. But what it means is that we have these electricity markets, electricity institutions surrounding them that were designed for one kind of system that's very rapidly changing. And so we need to figure out how to change our market design and our regulatory incentives to sort of catch up and get ahead of this energy transition. So it's super exciting. And we are living in the state that has sort of put itself on the bleeding edge of this transition, for better or worse, depending on who you talk to. So this is a graph from the California Energy Commission, and it's just showing you the rise of the increase in gigawatt hours of production from renewable energy. That blue is wind, the dark yellow is utility scale solar, and the light yellow is solar on your rooftop solar, so distributed solar. So we're seeing, that's just an amazing increase over a very short period of time. And I think it's really interesting. So I was on sabbatical in Europe, which was delightful for almost a year. Spent a little bit of time in Canada last year. I was back in Europe earlier this month. Jurisdictions are watching California. It's not like we're the only ones, but we are pushing the envelope. And I think there are a lot of jurisdictions trying to figure out what we're doing and how it's working. So I'm putting this up so you can't really read it. This is just showing you the world's greenhouse gas emissions. This is the United States. California is like less than 8% of the US. So California is less than 1% of global emissions. So to really have an impact with the kinds of changes we're making, I think we've got to export lessons learned, good and bad. What didn't work, what did work, because that's what I think is going to make the difference, right? Is showing other jurisdictions either it can be done or it can't be done, or we wish we didn't do that, because that can really start or continue to grease the wheels of policy and regulatory adoption elsewhere. Yep.
Yeah, just thinking about exporting the lessons learned from California, and thinking about how different the sort of renewable endowment is. Like, is that like part of the conversation? I mean, California is progressive in their policy, but there's also a much larger endowment, especially if you think about solar. In the state. So how do you think about exporting that idea to a place like the one I always think of, Illinois?
Yeah, so where I'm going to go with this is, you're right, because it's very different. So I was just in Canada, and they have a lot of hydro, and it's very different. But I think there's some basic economic principles, thinking about how, you want more renewables, how do you introduce the policies to get us there? I mean, you may have a different renewable resource, you might even have different politics, but I think we're learning things about cost recovery and rate design that can lead to unexpected outcomes. And this is a work in progress, and this is why it's fun to do this. It's like, I think we all should be thinking about how we talk to other jurisdictions about what's happening and what are the takeaways. And some of them are going to be very specific to our context, and I think others are going to be more broad in general. Okay, so the theme here is kind of hokey, but like California is a crucible, right? We're pushing in a lot of renewables really fast. And sort of heating things up really quickly, and things are happening, and sort of unpacking that and understanding what we can generalize and what is just like a kooky California thing that we can all talk about and find interesting. Okay, so what I want to do with my remaining time is, for those of you who haven't been following renewables so closely, just bring up speed pretty quickly on some of the things that have been happening and the sort of impacts and ripple effects of pushing a lot of renewables into the grid faster than the market would have invited them. Talk about how we did it, right? So this didn't just happen. It's sort of like policy carrots and policy sticks. And then point to some of the challenges I see, but this is a room with people doing research in all different areas, so I'd be curious where you're following. So when Californians talk about renewable integration, we often talk in terms of ducts. Some of you are all nodding, but some of you are like, what the duck is she talking about? So I'm going to start with the first duck, and then we'll move on to some other ducks and subsequently inspired. So this is the original duck. And for those of you who are, this is the first time meeting the duck, what am I graphing and who did it? So basically, literally what you're looking at, this is, the way I've heard it is there's an analyst, I think that they're CAISO analysts, who were sitting around back in like 2012, and they were just saying, okay, so we can graph net load, and what net load is, I'm showing you hourly load some day in March, and we'll talk why they chose March. So net load is just load, so the consumption, electricity consumption in California, subtract renewable generation, right? And so there's all this graph is doing is saying we're going to take the actual net load of 2012 and 2013. I think I have 2012, 2013 over the hours of the day. And then what they did, all they did is say, okay, we know that California has committed to renewable portfolio standards and mandates. We anticipate that we're going to get more and more and more solar on the grid. So what would that additional solar do to this net load profile? And the sun comes up and sets reliably every day. So as you put more and more and more solar, that solar production is carving out a deeper and deeper belly of the duck. That's one thing to note. And then the other thing to note is that the sun sets reliably every day, but Californians don't stop using electricity. They go home and they turn on their pool pumps and their wine coolers. And so we need generation to keep up with that in the later day, right? So I think why the duck captured our imagination is it's cute, and it also sort of illustrates two challenges of renewable energy integration. This potential for curtailment in the middle of the day if you don't have, if you have more solar production than you have demand, and two, this steep ramp that we're going to have to keep up with, and it's only going to get steeper. So we're almost off the charts, right? We're coming up on 2020. So this is sort of a way to illustrate the renewable challenges. Now, to be clear, all they're modeling here is net demand and solar production expected from the perspective of 2012. You might expect, and indeed we're seeing, the market to respond, right? We can do things like invest in storage or try and get more demand response to shift demand to better match our solar profile, et cetera. So this is just a sort of view from 2012 and sort of in some sense a warning of the challenges that would manifest if we didn't start mobilizing other solutions. So that's the net load duck. You might ask, has the duck shown up? This is taken from a number of people who have generated these graphs, but this is, we have the benefit of hindsight, looking back. We sure are seeing a duck show up. I should mention why we're looking at March. Duck season is sort of March, April, May. Does anyone know why, if you're going to build yourself a duck chart, that's a good set of months to look at? Yeah, so the sun is out, but it hasn't gotten really hot yet, so you don't have a lot of the AC in. So that's where those ducks really show up when you make these kinds of plots. So there's other ducks we've looked at. This one is thanks to my colleague, Catherine Wolfram. So you could also ask, well, what impact is this going to have on wholesale prices, right? If you start pushing more and more solar in, and the impact is sort of as you might expect. And if you really want to unpack this, an excellent paper, which you should all read because this is like born in Davis, is Jim Bushnell and Kevin Novin have written a really nice paper looking at, in much more detail than this duck, at what impact this increase in renewables integration has had on wholesale prices. But this duck chart sort of hits the high points. In duck season, we can have negative prices, right? You can have just like more solar than we need. But what we're seeing, and which is good news, because this is what the market should be doing, is much higher, or not much higher, but higher prices in this evening ramp to try and draw in sort of the nimble gas plants to pick up when the sun is setting and solar is dropping off. So we are seeing that start to shape up in the wholesale prices. And the final duck, and we'll come back to these ducks later on, but the final duck is I drew for a blog I wrote last month. So we are, unlike, so Hawaii is another state that's really pushing the envelope with renewables integration. Hawaii is an island in the middle of the ocean. So they have no neighbors to turn to say, you know what, we got some extra solar, can you buy some? Or wow, our solar generation, the sun is setting, can we import electricity from you? But California does have neighbors. And so what this graph is showing you is just, so this is blue is 2016, these are later years. what this is showing you is that you are seeing changes in electricity trade across state borders, sort of responding to this increase in solar. We're importing less or even exporting in some hours when the sun's out, and we're starting to import more resources from out of state to try and help us keep up with that. So these are some of the impacts that this increase in renewable energy and particularly solar integration are having on market outcomes in California markets. And most of these are pretty predictable, right? It's not rocket science to think about how the market should be responding. Okay, so what I want to spend the rest of my time doing is first looking backwards, saying how did we get here? It's one thing to mandate 40% renewables by 2020 or whatever you want. It's another thing to have it show up. So California it's showing up, and I want to think about how it's showing up, and to your point, how we did it, and what are some of the lessons learned that other jurisdictions might learn from, or are already learning from, and then finish with a forward-looking sort of what are the challenges. Okay, so when you think about how what California has done to increase renewables at such a rapid rate, a lot of that comes back to policy, carrots and sticks, especially carrots. We like carrots better than we like sticks, turns out. The RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, has played a major role. I think probably everyone in the room knows what that is, but just very quickly, you set a target, 33% renewables by 2020, and then you require that load-serving entities in the state show you that 33% of the kilowatt hours they sold came from a qualifying renewable resource. So they can point to it. And so in California, they're jointly implemented by the California Energy Commission and PUC. And historically, the big utilities have been the instrumental implementers in terms of delivering on these RPS requirements. And so when you look at, there's been some nice reports written on the California RPS and how it was implemented and what it cost. And what I'm showing you here, because I think it's kind of interesting, but not at all surprising for those of you who've been following what's been happening to renewable technology costs, is this graph is showing you an estimate of the average annual contract prices. So if you're a utility, if you're PG&E or if you're SDG&E and you're having to comply, you go to PUC and you show, yes, we've complied, we've signed enough contracts, this is the average contract price. And it's important to note that wasn't always the case, but at certain times, certainly early on, to comply, you had to sign long-term contracts to say, this is how I'm going to deliver by 2020, this is how I'm going to deliver by 2030. So you had these investor and utilities signing these long-term contracts. I was surprised by this. The initial contract prices were surprisingly low, but that's because there was some small hydro that they could, it was not yet depreciated and they could use that. But once all that was gone, these utilities started signing these long-term contracts, which at the time didn't seem that expensive. But with the benefit of hindsight, as renewable prices fall, looking back, they're quite expensive, right? So you've got these utilities, many of them locking into RPS contracts, which they were obligated to sign at high prices relative to where they are today. So then there's this other thing that happened in the wake of the electricity crisis that I didn't even know until relatively recently. There was an AB 117. It's hard to keep track of your assembly bills in California, but this one proved to be important. In the wake of the electricity crisis, AB 117 said, okay, local governments, you can stick it to the man, you can take a more active role in your procurement, and back to our default opt-in, opt-out, you can default people in. So how many of the people here think they buy their power from PG&E? And how many people here think that they buy it from a CCA? Yeah, so a lot of you are all defaulted onto the CCA, some people have opted out. You guys are an unrepresentative crowd. When I ask people where I live, we've all been defaulted into community CBE. Most people didn't even notice because you still get your bill from PG&E and you really got to go onto like page 94 to see that actually energy prices coming from your CCA. So this was passed back in 2002, but for a long time, you may have seen this graph already, for a long time, this is 2010, so for a long time, there was no CCA action at all, but more recently, you started to see these CCAs pop up, and now we're up to over 25%. I can't attest to this projection, I just heard it reported and re-reported over and over again, that the CPUC is projecting that by 2030, we could be up to 85% of load defected to direct access or CCAs. And so this has been a real change in a retail market structure and environment. How are they competing, right? So how are these CCAs competing with the PG&Es and the SCEs? Well, part of it is that everyone loves to hate PG&E, so if you get the offer to leave, well, maybe you'll take it. But the other thing that I think has been really important is that these CCAs have been able to take advantage of the fact that the utilities were holding on to these expensive legacy contracts. They could quite nimbly meet their RPS requirements using a relatively low renewable energy contract, sometimes buying the RECs from the utility who no longer needed them because they've lost their customers. And they've also been able to rely on, remember, the electricity prices in the wholesale market are getting really low, sometimes negative, so they can get wholesale electricity at relatively low prices. So I think I don't want to overstate cause and effect, but it sure seems like it, and please disagree with me, that the RPS, I'll get to your question in just a second, the RPS has certainly accelerated the penetration of wind and solar, but I think they've accelerated as well the fragmentation of retail procurement. There was very recently a change in the exit fee. So when you leave your PG&E provider, you're supposed to pay a cost that's supposed to reflect the net present value of all the contracts that were signed on your behalf. I looked at the old exit fee that I paid, and it sure didn't, I think it was too low. I think this is being upgraded in reform, but I think it was too low earlier on. So I do think that this is an interesting example of where RPS policies played a role in accelerating a not directly related phenomenon in the retail side of the market. And this is creating, and maybe some of you may be following this more closely than I am, and we'll come back to it. It's really changing the environment in terms of like who is responsible for procuring the renewables that will meet our future RPSs. Who is responsible for procuring the resources that will make sure that the system can continue to operate reliably as the penetration of renewables increases? I'm not taking a stand on whether it's bad or good, but it's just different. And I think it means we'll have to sort of implement our policies and our incentives differently. There's some questions or comments? Yep.
Yeah, you kind of said something I wanted to jump on that maybe I don't hear too frequently, but it's something that I'm actually looking at myself right now, was this idea that PG&E, everybody loves to hate PG&E. So like, what kind of decisions are people making when they choose to become part of a community choice aggregator or a municipal aggregation program or direct access? You kind of mentioned the fact that people may love to hate them and could make potentially an irrational decision and pay for higher power. Higher price power. Do you think there's empirical evidence for that?
I mean, there's anecdata when I talk to like the parents of the kids on my soccer team, and they're like, "Yeah, good riddance," but and when you push them, it's just, but yeah, I don't know. I think there's interesting questions, and we'll come back to this when it comes to resource adequacy. You've got a much more fragmented retail market, and the decisions, like it makes it more complicated, not better or worse necessarily, but more complicated when we're thinking about how to set up incentives so load serving entities can make the investments we're going to need to make sure we've got adequate resources.
Yeah, I thought about that question as well in terms of the resource adequacy. It's a little bit different here in California than on the east, where the capacity market kind of drives investment. I was thinking about it actually last night in terms of renewable investment. It is that kind of construct where there's no integrated resource planning. There's just this capacity market. Is that benefiting?
We'll come back to this. This is going to be this will be one of my things I want to come back to, because I think you're seeing, almost ironically, decentralization of the retail, or fragmentation of the load of the retail market is almost pushing us towards a more back to a centralized resource planning model, for fear that when you decentralize all those planning investment decisions, when you bring it back up, it might not be the optimal from a system-wide perspective. So there's like in real time, real interesting discussions right now.
Oh, sorry. Did you say you were going to come back to that?
Yeah, we are going to come. So you can hold it. I'm going to make because I think it's super interesting, and I'm still thinking my way through it. So I'd love to look at that. Okay, so I do want to make sure we talked about utility scale, right? But remember, it's not huge, but it is significant that we've also seen an increase in behind the meter distributed solar PV generation. So I wanted to talk about how we got there. I think you probably all know how we got there, but here's another example where I think there's lessons to be learned. I was in Ontario, totally different resource mix, et cetera, but this issue, I think, is starting to brew there, just as it has been brewing here. So we all love well, I'm Davis, lots of people love rooftop solar. I'm not gonna say it's bad. I do want to remind all of us that it's still the case. We've seen technology costs fall for renewable or for solar, but it's still the case that residential sort of distributed solar, there are diseconomies of scale. It's more cost effective per, however you want to measure it, per stall watt, per kilowatt hour, to build a big utility scale solar plant than it is, I mean, to have it in sort of small panels distributed. Now we can talk about whether there are other benefits associated with distributing it on rooftops versus having it centralized, but for now, just thinking about the technology costs, there are economies of scale to be realized from large scale solar installations. However, we've seen this rise of distributed solar. So what I'm showing you here is just the rise in distributed PV, where the blue is the capacity in that year, and then the yellow is adding it to the prior year's capacity. So what's been driving this? Because it's the economics don't make this appealing relative to the large scale utility. It's net metering, right? So for those of you who have not been paying, don't know what I'm talking about, I assume I'm talking to no one in this room. Under net metering, my neighbor has, we were just actually meeting with some utility folks yesterday, and they said, solar panels on your roof are like an IQ test, which is just, it makes a lot of sense from a private perspective. Why? So my neighbor, I failed the IQ test. We don't have solar panels on the roof, but my neighbor does. And so she's got these panels on her roof, and for every kilowatt hour she's generating, she gets a credit at that retail price, right? So the retail price per kilowatt hour. In California and in other states, the retail price per kilowatt hour reflects not only the variable costs we're avoiding because she's generating electricity with solar, the fuel costs, the labor costs. We recover a surprising share of our fixed costs, system fixed costs, in your volumetric rate. Right? So when you pay 25 cents per kilowatt hour for your power, you know, the wholesale price is about 5 cents. We've got a lot of the volumetric per kilowatt hour charge is coming from everything from the efficiency projects to the transmission and distribution fixed costs to you name it. So what that means is that those fixed costs aren't avoided when she generates electricity, but she's being sort of rebated sort of as if they were. Or put differently, net metering confers a subsidy. Sorry you can't see this very well at all, but this is taken from a recent paper that's not yet published yet, so we won't take a picture of it and distribute it on Twitter, but it lines up with the calculations we've done. This is asking about the subsidy in terms of dollar per month customer, and if you could read it, this would show you that in PG&E it's like close to $100. So major, pretty big subsidy, implicit subsidy through this net metering.
That was one thing.
Yes. That's for that customer. So I don't know if you read, Lucas has this, we have a blog at the Energy Institute. I'll give a little plug, and my colleague Lucas Davis said, you know, why am I paying 60 whatever dollars? I mean, yes, we're shifting those fixed costs from the adopters of the PV to the non-adopters of the PV. And you might say, yeah, but your neighbor is doing something to accelerate the clean energy transition. She's put solar panels on her roof, and you're right that there are sort of emissions that are not happening because you put solar on her roof. Here's another plug for a Jim Bushnell paper where they have sort of taken that seriously and said, back to your question about the social cost of carbon, like how big would the social cost of carbon have to be to make this a reasonable subsidy? And it is like really, really big in California. So I think the concern here is that the implicit subsidy in net metering is hard to justify. It's getting harder as we recover rising forest fire mitigation, forest fire adaptation costs in those rates. So it is a hard to justify subsidy, yes.
Do you think that this problem is going to explode with the new PUC requirement for new build?
This, I mean, it's reaching ahead, right? And so yes, because we're spreading the fixed costs onto a smaller and smaller base, right? As more and more and more households adopt solar, and that's only going to, the cost per non-adopter is only going to go up. So I think you can be concerned about the inefficiencies. It's suggesting that people are over-investing in distributed solar. I think what's really concerning is the distributional aspects, because if you think about who the typical owner of a distributed PV system is. Not always the case, but on average wealthier. So you're basically shifting fixed costs from wealthy households to renters and low-income households and households. It's a sweeping generalization, but on average, if you squint, that's about what's happening. And so I think that that is going to be bigger. So what I take away from this, and this is where you can see it happening in other jurisdictions, is it's exacerbating the inefficiencies. It's not net metering that's to blame. Necessarily, it's a combination of net metering with the way we structure our rates. And it's really, so this is not like, I think people vilify net metering. I think it's that brutal combination of net metering and a rate structure where we're covering a lot of fixed costs in our volumetric charges. And so Severn Bornstein calls this sloppy rate making. You know, you gotta recover the costs, so yeah, let's recover them in the volumetric charge. The cost of doing it that way is rising and rising and rising. As solar PV adoption, distributed solar increases, and that fixed cost component increases. And I'm not a prophet, but I sense it's reaching a breaking point in terms of when you're looking at the projected retail prices and what that would imply for the cross subsidy. I've read that the cross subsidy here is now much larger than the CARE program, where we're sort of raising rates for higher income to subsidize low income. So that's really perverse when you think about the combination. Sorry, question. And in terms of the RPS, so when I think about generalizable lessons, and I'd like to hear from you, with the net metering, it is just be careful how you recover costs. They can create sloppy rate making can create really perverse incentives. What's really interesting is Hawaii. I've been talking to folks in Hawaii. So one idea is, okay, SMUD is headed kind of in this direction. Let's take all the fixed costs out of the volumetric rates. So now your cost per kilowatt hour is the true variable cost, and stick it all in the fixed costs. What's interesting in Hawaii is so long as you're trying to recover costs that aren't directly electricity supply related. So for example, forest fire mitigation, forest fire adaptation, energy efficiency programs, you can run the risk of going from load defection to grid defection. If you drive that fixed cost component up high enough, you might have people prematurely cutting the cord and investing in storage. So Hawaii is in a situation like that, where they got to recover the cost somewhere. They put it in the volumetric charge, you see lots of distributed PV. You put it in the fixed charge, you see grid defection. So a very perhaps provocative proposal we're pushing is some of these costs could be spread onto a wider tax base. Like when we're thinking about vegetation management, which is a cost of living with climate change, why are we recovering in the electricity bills? Let's put it in the tax base where we could potentially more effectively manage distributional concerns and low-income household impacts there. So I think that is a very live area of research that is an interesting mix of environmental economics, public finance. And then when it comes to the RPS, I think that economists often make themselves unpopular by pointing out that RPSs are not the most efficient way to incentivize renewables. You're subsidizing green without taxing dirty power, right? So you're not incentivizing fuel switching. You're not targeting the subsidy at the renewables that are most valuable. You're paying it per kilowatt hour, wherever that solar is, versus really trying to target it. That said, technology mandates have political appeal. Americans in blue and red states will vote for, or at least tolerate, green technology subsidies in ways that they will not even think about supporting a carbon tax. And I've made myself unpopular among economists by saying that alone is a reason to think about at least doing research and trying to inform the debate over RPSs and just make the RPS the most efficient RPS we can make it. Because if it's going to be here, I think there are good and bad RPSs. There are ways to design these mandates to rely as much on market signals to make sure those renewable resources are the more cost-effective renewable resources, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there is some work to be done in terms of thinking about these mandates and how to make sure they're both cost-effective and interact, at least not perversely, with pre-existing incentives and regulations. Yes.
I wonder about the use of the word sloppy here for rate design, because I think it's purposeful. It's maybe not efficient, but
I'm gonna push back. I think it's sloppy.
Isn't the idea that there's some assumption, whether it's like sort of implicit or explicit, really, that the costs are pushed into the variable or the volumetric because putting it into the fixed chart would adversely affect people who are poor because there's an assumption there's a correlation between usage and income. Isn't that the reason why that?
I still think it's sloppy in the following. Ideally, I'm wearing my like pointy economics hat here. You want cost structure to reflect cost causation. If we're worried about low income, there are other ways to transfer, maybe the income transfer resources without really distorting the incentives on the margin. So I think, yeah, trying to get the cost causation right. And I am going to go back to mine. I realize that not everyone will agree with me, but there are some of these costs that just shouldn't be in the electricity rates.
Right, it's just easier. It's an easier method to tax than actually passing.
So we're not, maybe like sloppy easy is synonymous in this case. It's easier, but it is sloppy, and as the stakes get higher, the cost of that sloppiness could get really prohibitive. Yes.
So we've kind of heard a variety of perspectives on like how aggressive California should be in pursuing, you know, RPS as an example of their aggressive climate goals. But kind of what you're getting at a little bit is that, you know, California is sort of a global leader, so, you know, we have influence in the rest of the world. But in a sense, that means that Californians are subsidizing, maybe heavily subsidizing, the global decarbonization transition. And to me, there's a lot of sense in that. California is an economically strong state. There's a really strong environmental ethos. But could there be some sort of a limit, some sort of breaking point where that can kind of crumble and there could be a change in direction? Is that something that we should be really worried about?
So this is me speaking personally, I would say yes. And the reason I spend, you know, I get like upset emails saying like, why are you spending your time beating up on climate policy? Like, don't you have better things to do? Let's get back to my Canadian. In Ontario, we had feed-in tariffs, like we had very expensive renewable energy policy in a reasonably liberal province. And people just got so fed up. It was like baby with the bathwater. And I'm not saying that, but one, you gotta be careful what you learn from that, but I do think like more careful attention to, yes, we wanna be ambitious, and yes, we're willing to pay, and yes, we're willing to lead, but let's lead in the most, like, let's try and be really careful and judicious in terms of how we lead, and spending a lot more money than we have to meet renewable energy goals or energy efficiency goals, I think has a cost. Both a monetary cost, but also potential political cost if we lose support for our ambition because it's sort of pushed to a breaking point. Now, I won't pretend to know where the breaking point is. I just think it's a real danger that is another reason to be really pay a lot of attention to not only what we're trying to do, but how we do it.
If you had to guess like where or how that breaking point happens,
I don't know. But I am concerned. Like if you look at the, you know, I've spent a little bit of time talking to environmental justice communities who have very real legitimate concerns about like, why am I paying for your climate goals? And I think that that's a pretty important question that we should be thinking about, both from an efficiency and a distributional. Did you have that? Yeah.
Yeah, I have two things. The first one is sort of a question or pushback on sort of taking some of the like vegetation management tax and like taxing the broad public and making those funds available for political discussion. And I could see it, whereas if it's coming out of like the PUC mandating you have to spend so much, it seems like a more like we can make sure this happens through regulation versus if it's the funds are taxes, which means politicians have their hands in the pot. I worry if it would mean that those funds would just be used elsewhere and not for vegetation management, whereas you're better able to like earmark the funds for the specific purpose through
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. And that's where we've just started a project to think about exactly this, both the political economy of what we're suggesting and how you'd actually do it, like which step. So I think there are trade-offs. Here's another reason to be concerned. The higher those electricity rates get, so when you think about how we're gonna read our goals, electrification. We want to electrify buildings, we want to electrify vehicles, we want to electrify, like you name it, we want to electrify it. If those rates keep going up and up and up, like that is gonna be, we're like, working against ourselves. So I think the arguments you're raising are really important, and they have traditionally, and this is not to dismiss them, they have traditionally been seen as like, this is just not a viable way forward. But I think that, again, the cost of leaning, like taking too much out of the electricity price are getting higher. So I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but it is a research project we're pursuing to say, how would we actually do this? What are the political risks? What are the distributional implications?
And then one more about the sloppy rate design. In terms of if you put one with a fixed cost and a fixed cost charge, and then the variable, you're decreasing, like when you make behavior changes, the amount you'll see in the cost savings through those behavior changes will be smaller and smaller, and they're already small to begin with. And so I worry, like, will that send like wrong price signals for folks that are trying to make behavior change in terms of their consumption? If like, you know, if the variable rate is higher and then I, you know, switch over to energy efficient washer, that savings will appear higher and maybe further facilitate that behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in this, there is such a thing as electricity prices that are too high, right? That are just like, you are maybe irrationally reducing consumption because the price you're paying is well above, I'm not saying is well above where it truly is. And so I guess that there is that possibility, but there's also the possibility that people are, you know, if as the price gets to 30 cents per kilowatt hour, we are doing too much. Dave is like
electric
squirming.
vehicles. Like, I mean, if you have one goal, which is to incentivize solar and energy efficiency, that is now at odds with another goal, which is electrifying transportation.
Or buildings, or
And so,
yeah.
I mean,
No, I think that's right.
I think that Meredith's got a really powerful point that I think is something that is lost a lot in this debate, and that I want you guys to really consider adopting as your own, which is that efficient pricing is going to maximize the size of the pie, and then these different distributional things do them in other ways. Like they're not. It's not that we're saying they're not important, but if you have really high prices, you're going to be like disproportionately high prices. You're going to be distorting the market, and things like electric vehicle adoption are going to be inhibited by that, which I think is also something that you probably care about, moving, you know, transportation emissions, you know, downwards as well.
Yep.
I just wanted to not leave unchallenged the suggestion that California is the leader of the world.
I don't think I hear your accent.
Yeah.
I should have mentioned.
And there's this backlash to California doing such a fantastic job on carbon policy.
Yeah.
There are some great things happening here, but from a European perspective, on transport, California is astonishingly terrible.
Thank you. Thank you.
Behavior
You're absolutely
change
right.
as well on things like diet. Again, California way behind Europe. Electricity obviously is where there is some great leadership, but equally in European countries, they've got just as ambitious targets on renewable energy, just as ambitious targets on net neutrality. Good stuff, but I just didn't want everyone to think California doing such a good job. One of my comments is too unpopular, but
No, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And so I lived in Switzerland. Yes. So we are pushing the envelope, but there are plenty of other countries pushing the envelope. And in some cases, I think we are pushing harder. In other cases, we are learning. And that's where I should have mentioned at the beginning. The meeting I went to in Europe was all about learning from, and there was arguably way more learning being done, California from other jurisdictions versus the other way around. I guess the point is recognizing that that is a big objective of this, is trying to trade lessons. But thank you. Point well taken. Yes.
I'm not sure if you mentioned this, and I have to step out.
Yep.
And I'm new to the energy space. I mean, personally, my personal life in terms of career. But I know you mentioned a lot Canada, and I'm Canadian, among other things.
Good, yes.
So what do you think about Ontario's model deregularizing energy and the impact that has in terms of energy adoption in all these different areas?
Can you be a little more specific? There's a little more specific about what you're referring to, because there's a lot happening in Ontario. So
for example, Ontario Hydro, used to be our premier energy source, and that's what everyone was used to. And whatever the rate was set at, you had to pay the rate because that was the only person in town.
Yep.
So I know that they had some deregulation of that and let other players come into the market, and then all of a sudden it was like the wild, wild west for us in the late 90s, early 2000s, where all these people were knocking at your door and we can do this rate or we can do that rate. I don't know that we actually realized any energy savings, but it just kind of brought a different feel, because then you had this other choice and option, but not that it really impacted. And you might have talked about this.
No. So we're going to talk about something like that. We're seeing something similar happening in California, and the reasons are different, but the reality is it's very similar on the ground, which is you're replacing this incumbent utility that used to be the only game in town, especially when it's like cut the cord and make your own shoes, grow your own food, and make your own energy, to now, which you are now probably purchasing your power from a community choice aggregator. It's not the same retail choice, but you are seeing this fragmentation and this opening up of the retail sector to new upstarts who may or may not be promising you something that's truly better for you. I'm not going to be touching on it. I think, let me get here and just talk about one dimension of that, and then you can come back if I totally missed the mark. So we don't have that much time, but I do want to spend the rest of the time looking forward and thinking about like where we're going. So we've already come pretty far in terms of hitting our renewable portfolio standard targets and passing them, but we have like the trajectory is up in terms of like the level of ambition. When you think about what has to happen to integrate more and more renewables, like 50, 60, 70%, it's going to require some combination of, and this is not an exhaustive list, more nimble generation to keep up with that evening ramp, demand response, so like more of us are consuming energy when the sun is out versus when the sun is setting, storage, so we can sort of move energy around to when we're actually using it, more integrated and optimized grid operations, behavioral changes, other things, right? And so one of the big questions that I think is like the meta question, and then there's research to be done diving into the specific nuance, is our existing market and policy incentives that we have today set up to the task of coordinating the deployment of all these strategies effectively and efficiently? And I think the answer is no. So then that leaves the question, okay, so what is the right market design, policy incentives, et cetera, that's going to get us from 30% to 60% or wherever we're heading at like a closest to minimum cost as we can, keeping in mind some of the distributional concerns we've been thinking about. But going back to our sort of price duck, one of the concerns is we're going to need to build more nimble gas plants or nimble generation if we don't rely entirely on storage and demand response. And I'd be interested in the opinion of the room here, but anyone I talk to says we need all of it. We can't do it all with batteries. We can't do it all with demand response. We're going to need it all. And so one of the common concerns is if we're getting negative prices, we may be seeing resources exit the market when in fact we need these nimble resources staying in the market. So one of the questions is like the current market incentives, are they sufficient? Do we need a capacity market? Do we need something to reward and incentivize the entry of nimble generation that can help us manage an increasingly, a fuel mix that's increasingly intermittent and renewable? The way California does it is with resource adequacy requirements. This is sort of to your question earlier on, and is it getting to your question, which is, well, how we do in California, we don't have a capacity market, we don't have a pure energy only market. Loosely speaking, we basically say to the LSEs, we are going to require you to sign long-term contracts to meet your future load and make sure that the lights don't go out, basically. And what I think is really interesting, and I have way more questions than answers, is now that we've got this like transformation happening, when instead of giving that directive to 4 major utilities and some co-ops, we have like hundreds of these community choice aggregators and load serving entities, and understanding how to delegate that resource adequacy responsibility and how to prescribe but still allow them the flexibility to find their own optimal arrangement of investments, I think is a pretty important challenge. And I'm not saying that we can do it, that we're at a disadvantage by having lots of load serving entities. I don't know either way. I do know that it's a pretty big daunting challenge when we're like putting our foot on the gas in terms of getting from 30 to 60, 70%. And so some of the questions I've heard, I've been sort of talking to folks and I've been to a couple of conferences about this. And so there is a concern, one, if our existing renewable resource adequacy incentives are not fully reflected in our existing regulations and market incentives, who's going to pick up the slack? So when you're, suppose you signed on with some load serving entity, you look good, but then they collapsed or they don't have the resources that they need, who is the entity that picks up the slack? Do we punish the customers who signed on with that outfit, or do we socialize it? I think there's some pretty interesting questions along that. And then the other question that is, again, I'm not articulating it well, but it's been interesting to be part of this conversation. There's one proposal that just says, look, tell every load serving entity to go back and do some 8,760 analysis. So every day will I have enough resources in place to be able to keep the lights on. But even if they do those decentralized optimization, when we bring all our plans back together, is the combination of those plans giving us a resource investment plan that's actually optimal for the big system? Are there redundant investments being made? So I think there are just some really interesting tensions between decentralization and coordination, and questions about how we design policy and markets to negotiate this, and pretty darn quickly, because we're looking ahead at some ambitious increases in renewables. And just, yes.
Just sort of on that, like a lot of the solutions I've been seeing to this resource adequacy problem and the rise of CCAs kind of wreck whatever competitive advantages the CCAs had that allowed them to proliferate. So,
but is that bad? You mean
well,
they can't rely just on short-term contracts, because basically they're being told you got to sign.
So either they have to develop these really robust contracts that are going to make their rates go way up, or you have some sort of central buyer, but then that completely eliminates any sort of competitive edge they have over anybody.
Right.
So is there any? I mean, is there a good way to?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of inclined to think that they, and again, I need to be very careful. This is not the most informed opinion, but I feel like they've been able to leverage in the fact that they have been so nimble, probably to an excessive extent. Because the winds change direction, and so I think that maybe I think what I hear you saying, or at least what I'm wondering, is will we overcorrect? We need to rein them in a bit because they've been just taking advantage of the situation they're in vis-a-vis their incumbents who are tied up in these legacy contracts. But we could push it so far that we sort of squelch any of the exciting innovation that they're bringing in terms of community-oriented solutions and local resource management.
I guess an implicit question is, should they exist? Like, do they only exist because the market was structured in such a way that is inherently bad, but that's the only condition in which they can't exist?
I think as a research agenda, so I have like 2 grad students asking questions. I hope there's some in this room. I think it's a really important question. And I do think it could be an example where California this is kind of we push this faster than it happened in other places, and maybe this is a way to learn to get some questions that other jurisdictions might need.
Yeah, because I think you're saying like their competitive advantage comes from the fact that they're neglecting any reliability, like resource adequacy, reliability constraints. They're buying the amount of energy, but the energy doesn't come at the time of the peak consumption, and so they're just.
And they would argue they're not neglecting, but I think it's conceivable there. So I think it's a question. Okay, I know I'm almost out of time, so I want to talk about one more thing, and then we'll wrap it up. So I want to get back to this dot that I made because I think this is really interesting. So, like I said, we're not an island. We've got neighbors. We have differences with our neighbors in terms of our level of climate policy ambition and how much we're willing to spend as a population versus some of our neighbors. But those neighbors could be really important in reducing the renewable integration costs, right? Because it would be very costly for us to meet our renewable energy goals, just us, versus recognizing the fact that we could export summer solar and then import when the wind dies down and the sun sets. And so what this graph is showing you is we're already seeing some of that. But it's still the case that the Western interconnect is basically 38 balancing areas. There is trade between them, but I think the general consensus is there's more gains from trade to be exploited. And there are frictions and seams issues that's limiting the extent to which we can optimize seamlessly across that area. And so we can argue about how big those gains are, but I've yet to meet anyone, please do disagrees with this basic principle. That there's more trades, more mutually advantageous trades to be won. We have tried in the past, right? So there has been initiatives in the West to try and integrate the market. Those have failed. I don't want to oversimplify. There were complicated reasons why, but one of the reasons that we at least heard a lot about, whether politically this was the killer, but what we heard a lot about was great to integrate the market. We could use our resources more effectively, but the more integrated the market, two related concerns. One, remember we talked about leakage and resource shuffling. The more integrated the market, the more likely it is that we'll just reduce emissions associated with California, but increase emissions, or not. There will be emissions reduction on paper. Right? California will say, yes, we'll import your wind, Nevada, but we're not turning the coal plant off. We're just putting on paper the wind generation here and the coal generation there. So be it leakage or resource shuffling, you can imagine how more integrated markets could exacerbate that problem. And relatedly, there were concerns about autonomy. Will California be more limited in our ability to steer our own ship and pursue our own goals if we're integrated more with a regional market, where the implications of our ambition may be felt by other stakeholders and other trading partners? So that has been a sticking point that has limited our access to those gains from trade that we haven't sought yet. There's an interesting experiment happening in the energy imbalance market little market. Maybe some of you have heard of it, maybe others don't know what I'm talking about. This is a little like last minute market. It's 2 to 5% of the transactions. It's not big in terms of like value, but it's pretty important. And basically what it does is it's a CAISO and volunteers, like whoever else in the West wants to play. If you participate in the IM, you basically surrender the scheduling of your resources and to a centralized coordinator who can much more nimbly respond to last minute changes in supply and demand. And I've talked a lot to Mark Rothletter, who's one of the architects of the market, and he's just got some really amazing data suggesting that we've seen reductions in curtailment in resources, solar resources. You see less redundancies in investments in like ramping resources because you've just got one central manager versus these little balkanized regions trying to respond in real time. So that's super exciting. The thing that I'm excited about but cautious about is the EIM is a proof of concept with some caveats that I'll have to talk about quickly, of a market that's been able to access or make progress on market integration while also respecting the integrity or trying to respect the integrity of greenhouse gas accounting. Because it's basically got a carbon adder on resources that want to come in, and it also charges out-of-state resources for reshuffling emissions. It's a very crude approximation, but it's basically trying to say, we want your power, but we want to account for the emissions implications of your power. And so it's an example of a market that's trying to do both. It's successful enough that market participants are looking at expanding it to the day ahead. Very exciting, because I think there are real efficiency gains. But what's really going to be interesting, and I think what is right now, it's just like, it's not clear what's going to happen, is the kinds of fixes we've made in the EIM, like a 2 to 5% market, are probably not going to work in a big market when the stakes are higher. I mean, I think that it's how those calculations are made are a little bit fast and loose. Okay for 2 to 5%, but probably not for a much larger share. The other thing I think that I'll finish with this because I think it's a research interest of mine. What the EIM does is it basically charges out-of-state resources for emissions that we think happen when cleaner resources get sent to California. So if you're a wind generator in Nevada, I'm still taxing you for some emissions because I'm saying, yeah, you're coming here, but there's reshuffling going on outside. One concern I have is if you raise the price of admission to the EIM, maybe resources will go to the bilateral market or other markets where the accounting isn't so transparent, and we lose the efficiency gains of drawing those players into a more efficient, nimble market because we're erecting these sort of greenhouse gas accounting costs, trying to make the accounting perfect, but kind of losing efficiency in the process. So that is to say, I think it's a work in progress right now, and there are real policy questions that could be answered with real data. The EIM is a very rich like sandbox of like sub-hourly data. So I think it's, at least I have my eye on it as an area where it's a really interesting mix of market design, greenhouse gas accounting, political economy, and great data, where you could imagine some sort of constructive and interesting research could happen. Okay, so in summary, I think that what's going on in California, not that there's lots of interesting, more ambition arguably in Europe, but what's going on in California is a work in progress, lessons to be learned type setting. I think if there's a punchline here, it is that our renewable energy investments will fall short of their full potential if they're plugged into an electricity market that's not set up to absorb them. So we need policy innovation and market design innovation along with technology innovation. Challenges I'm following, but we'd love to hear more from you. Market and policy incentives that align cost allocation with cost causation. Because when we get sloppy or we do the thing that's easy, as the stakes get higher, the distortions can get really, really large. Redesigning retail rates, I think it's time, and there's already talk about it in those movements, but I think it's going to become more important going forward. And this is my sort of pet area, but I invite you to join me because I think there's lots of interesting economics here, how to access the efficiency gains from more integrated markets while also sort of respecting the policy differences and ensuring the greenhouse gas accounting integrity of those states that are trying to achieve emissions within the borders. Stop there and take time for questions. And if we don't have time, you can send me an email and we can talk research. Thank you. Yeah.
So recently the Public Utilities Commission voted to extend some once-through cooling plants
Oh, yeah.
in California. I'm wondering, even though the local communities, I think we're pushing to have them close at the date that they originally have been planning to close, do you think that was avoidable, that extension? And if so, like how did it, given that we kind of knew, California kind of knew about the duck curve and some of these sort of capacity concerns a while ago, do you think they could have done something different to have those go offline?
I don't know enough about the issue, I'm afraid, but I think I've heard a little bit about it, and it's being held up as a like, look, we need to get moving on this because like we're not getting the investments we need, and so we're making decisions we wish we didn't have to make to compensate for the decisions we made. That's how I've heard that scenario sort of interpreted, but I'm afraid I don't know enough about the specifics to weigh in. Yep.
So you've talked about the challenge of emissions leakage and shuffling,
Yep.
but is there an opportunity maybe to address that by just changing the boundaries within which we account emissions? Like a lot of people like to account within the balancing authority, but what if you just expand that to the interconnect or like some other region that?
So there's this interesting trade-off between leakage and reshuffling, right? So what we do already is kind of what you're saying, which is we have like a border carbon adjustment. If you want to sell power into electricity into California, first deliverers have to say, here's the plant that's generating, and that's the emissions intensity, and they have to purchase permits. So we've already done that. The concern is as follows. When we do that, and we say, okay, we're going to charge every ton of carbon or $20, what ends up happening is for all those out-of-state resources, they say, the wind plant, just send it to California, but we're not turning off the coal plant, we're just reshuffling the resources. So it solves one problem, but kind of like whack-a-mole, it creates another one. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it is a solution to leakage on paper. We're accounting for all our emissions and our emissions are going down. But one of the concerning things for me, I'm not saying it's just suggestive, when you look at where California greenhouse gas emissions reductions have come from, majority have come from the electricity sector. Transportation's going up, industrial emissions holding steady. And then within the electricity sector, where are the emissions reductions coming from? Reduced emissions intensity of imports. So that could be a good thing, but it also could mean that that our trading partners are just on paper saying, yep, we'll send you our hydro and our renewables, but nothing's actually happening. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but that's the worst fear, that it's just on paper. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I think your solution solves one problem, but I think it doesn't eliminate potential that this is just contraction. It would be nice not to end on such a negative note. Please email me. Yeah, I'm around most of the day, and email me if you have questions that we're not answering. Thank you.
For those that are staying for lunch, I know there's a number of students staying. It'll be in the fishbowl. I know. What else can we call it? It's no fish. Thank you. Yeah, you were in there earlier. Yeah. It's confusing that the turned out to be that because then you're like, what did I do?